Documentary filmmaker Michael Moore was one of the only people to publicly predict that Donald Trump was going to win the 2016 election. He felt like he knew the blue-collar, angry white voter well enough to predict a win, when everyone else was saying there was absolutely no way that Trump could win the election. So that old corpulent liberal was right, while all of the Ivy League-educated pundits were wrong. So chalk one up for Michael Moore, which is good for a few talk show conversations, and now maybe even a Broadway play. And as eager as you have been to get a part on Broadway, Erica, I guess you can be glad that you didn't get The Terms of My Surrender and you did get Carousel. I don't know if there's going to be a lot of singing in The Terms of My Surrender. But okay. But what makes Michael Moore worthy of mention here today is the fact that he not only predicted Trump's win in 2016, but he has already predicted that he's going to win again in 2020. Yeah. Go ahead. Oh. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? But Moore doesn't think he'll win because he deserves to win or that he's earned it, but he's reading the tea leaves of disharmony among the progressive voters. For the past 10 months, people on every talk show have been talking about how did Trump win? When perhaps the question we really need to dig into is, how did progressives lose? We have to start asking what Will McAvoy, I can't quote it very accurately here, but in the first episode of The Newsroom, when the character of Will McAvoy goes into a rant on stage, he asks the question, if liberals are so effing smart, why do they lose so GD always? And folks, I think that's the question we really need to answer. I recently published an article in the Daily Kos about what I call liberal cannibalism. After experiencing the meltdown of the committee that planned the protest when Donald Trump came to town a few weeks ago, and as if to prove me right, and I was writing the article to say that liberals love nothing more than correcting a conservative unless they have the option of eating the flesh off of another liberal who is just different from them by the tiniest degrees. And then I published that article, and the people that served on that committee with me immediately got out their forks and knives and went to work. A local candidate for the office of Congress wrote to me privately and said, I would confront them for this cyberbullying, but I'm afraid they would turn on me. And that, I think, is the whole problem. Liberals have a hard time getting along with one another. We tend to be idealists, and that idealism tends to express itself in a kind of perfectionism. And ironically, it expresses itself in almost fundamentalist-like passional doctrinal purity. As much as we despise the fact that Donald Trump almost never admits that he's wrong, he never apologizes for anything, no matter how obviously wrong he was. But I want to challenge each of you and myself as well to think about, how long has it been since you apologized for anything? How long has it been since you just sat up and accepted that you were wrong about something and admitted it, wrote a letter of apology to someone? Do you ever admit that you were wrong? Or do you not try to figure out some way that ultimately you were right and they just misunderstood you or they didn't get it? Do you try to make amends? Do you try to keep relationships together? Or do you unfriend people in real life as easily as we do on Facebook? Now, I came to Springfield in 1991 to take the helm of a virtually shipwrecked church. Church politics can be really mean, and in this case, a small number of very power-hungry people had quite secretly harassed the senior minister, the associate minister, the secretary, and the custodian, and the office manager into all quitting virtually at once. The majority of the members of the church had absolutely no idea what had been going on behind the scenes to cause such a sudden collapse, and they were determined to never let it happen again. So in 1991, as a fairly young pastor, I became the captain of a ship that was sinking very fast. And I had to plug a lot of holes to keep a fairly large institution from just sinking in general demise. Most of the people who were responsible for the staff's departure, once they had been outed, once everybody knew who had been involved in it, they were sufficiently embarrassed to just move on to cause problems in other churches. Most noticeably, they moved on to First and Calvary and succeeded in firing a couple of people there. But there was one couple that was determined to deny that they were ever involved. And they were going to stay and rehabilitate their reputation. In fact, they were so determined that when I came to town with my little family, they showered us with gifts, dinners out, warmth, enthusiasm. And the chairman of the board of that church was not too happy to see that going on. He came to my office one day, and he wanted to warn me about being chummy with this family that had caused so much disruption in the church just a few months earlier. And I was trying to be the healer, the reconciler. I was 33 years old and saw myself as somehow in a messianic role there, that I was going to make everything okay. Everybody was going to be all right. And this board chairman, who had been the chair of the communication department at Drury University, said something that day in July of 1991 that I've never forgotten. He said to me, "Roger, a snake doesn't have to bite you to be a snake." It's a hard saying, and I want to be quick to say that if religion does not offer to its adherents the possibility that a person can change, then we have no reason to exist. If religion means anything at all, it has to hold out the opportunity that people can improve their lives by conscious decision. There's not a person here who has not, by internal effort at some point, given up on past prejudices, thought your way through things that you had inherited in the air of your childhood that you have been able to dismiss. Most of us can even describe several changes that we have made in our character through our conscious choice because we wanted to become better people. Dietrich Bonhoeffer expressed the belief in his rather more confessional faith that forgiveness without confession is cheap grace. And don't let that point slip past you. That is, a person can change, and forgiveness should almost always be virtually guaranteed. People deserve the chance to change, to grow, to learn. But Bonhoeffer insisted that the only way that makes sense is if you are willing to be honest about the offense, if you're willing to be confessional. If they are simply denying their guilt and insisting that everyone around them join them in that denial, then they're not really changing at all. There are times when any one of us really needs to be forgiven for something that we've done. But what we usually try to get out of our friends is for them to tell us that we're innocent. You did the best you could. You didn't know. Anyone would have done the same thing. When we know those things aren't true, that we prefer the lie of innocence to honest forgiveness. I'm sure that there is someone in advertising or in marketing who has persuaded Donald Trump to always throw back his shoulders, stick his chest out, and whatever he said or did is exactly what he should have said or done, no matter how wrong it was, no matter how heinous. And we all know how silly, how disappointing, how embarrassing it is to watch him do that. But do you really think it looks any better on you? Do you really? I mean, we're not president of the United States. We're not in front of TV cameras all the time. But denial, instead of confession and forgiveness, looks just as absurd on us as it does on the Clementine Caligula. At least in the case of this fellow at my former parish, Bonhoeffer was entirely correct. Once the embers from the fire he had initially started at that church had grown cold and the congregation was growing, it was becoming healthy again, he went to work doing everything he could do to dishonestly and unethically undermine absolutely everything I did. I was there for 16 years, and there was a parking lot committee meeting every month at the end of the board meeting when he was trying to organize people to undermine anything that we were trying to do. And I think it's fair to say that I lost a few nights' sleep just energetically hating him. But as I've looked at this across the decades, I realized that the failing was not entirely his. The rest of us, including me, also failed him because we never cared enough to try to save him from himself. We never tried to reach out to him in a way that was sufficiently confrontational to say, you really don't want to be the jerk you are being. You really don't want to be this guy. You can change. You can be different. Formally, what we're talking about here is at least a subtext of situational ethics. I love the way that comedian Dave Barry summed it up, that if the person you're with for dinner tonight is being nice to you but mean to the waiter, you're having dinner with a mean person. There's really no two ways to parse that. What I have observed about human nature during my nearly 40 years of parish ministry is that people are not often consciously aware of how they are poisoning their interpersonal relationships precisely because no one ever reflects it back to them. No one ever says to them, you're being mean, you're being dishonest, you're being toxic. Their immediate circle of family and friends, because the snake has never bitten them, will ignore the instances of being mean to the waiter, gossiping about a neighbor, or playing power games, whether it's at church or at their office or even in volunteer groups. You notice places where you volunteer that the pool of volunteers is constantly changing, and usually not because people's personal schedules change. Usually it's ego battles, that someone got their feelings hurt over something that was so petty it would have embarrassed Charles Darwin if it had been written down, but it never gets discussed. The committee that flew to Louisville, Kentucky to recruit me to come to Springfield and rebuild this church were very honest with me about what had happened. They sat down at a hotel meeting room table and told me all about what had happened that made all the staff change. And there were 8 of them that flew up there to recruit me, and they promised me that it would never happen again, that they had learned their lesson, and that I would never have to defend myself, that they would nip it in the bud. If it started to happen again, they would address it. And they were true to their word for at least 6 weeks. Some of them, a couple of months. Yeah. We are reflexively self-protective. Most of the time when we see someone being mean to the waiter, we just make a mental note of it, and we try to make sure that we're never in their sights. Just like the congressional candidate that said to me, I can't believe what they're saying about you, and I would get involved except they would do the same thing to me. And so we will skate through life avoiding that conversation so that we can shrug our shoulders and say, well, he's never been mean to me. But what is really in the best interest of the person who is being nice to you and being mean to the waiter? What would help them to be a better person? Does denial actually help them, or doesn't it literally set them up to do even worse the next time? When we started our little liberal outpost of a church in this red state, We said in our mission statement that it was our goal to role model what it meant to be a healthy spiritual community, because we didn't see any examples of healthy spiritual communities anywhere around us. Prior to our startup in 2008, every church I had ever served simply tried to cover up the emotional landmines that existed there and pretended that they weren't there. The seasoned members of the church knew where the landmines were, and they did sort of an elaborate dance to be sure that they never stepped on the landmines. Newcomers who didn't know what was going to hit them when they wandered onto the wrong topic or said something in the wrong way became short-term members. Pastorally, we often call a church a healing community. It's a place where people can come and be loved when the world or family has wounded us. We show acceptance, we show approval, we show love, and we tolerate one another's eccentricities. Because I don't know if you all knew this, but you've all got them. We've all got our own bizarre little eccentricities. I've always said, you build a church out of broken parts. All of us have things that take something out of the people around us to be able to put up with us. But healing is ultimately about more than binding up wounds. It's like that old saying from the Salvation Army. It doesn't make sense to keep bandaging up the people at the bottom of the cliff if you never go to the top of the cliff and find out who's throwing these people off. That we come to a healing community because there is some deficit in us that we want to have fixed. But everything isn't about stitches and bandages. Sometimes it's surgery. Sometimes there's really something that needs to be removed. When the famous psychiatrist M. Scott Peck turned his career in the direction of teaching community building skills, he famously said that community is tolerant of everything except intolerance. That is, an intentional community can foster the health of anyone who comes in wanting to get healthy, but the community itself cannot exist if it tolerates those who seek to destroy the community through their own special brand of hostile intolerance. Now, next month, I'm traveling to Clemson, South Carolina, and the invitation initially came about 6 months ago for me to come and speak in the morning at a Unitarian church, and then in the evening to speak at a UCC church. And these two congregations are sharing the same building, and they keep talking about being able to merge their two small, struggling congregations, neither of which can afford to exist on their own, but they haven't been able to do it. So somebody had the bright idea, well, the most diplomatic person I know is Roger Ray. Let's get Roger Ray down here. The theological differences between these two groups is so slight, and both congregations swear in their mission statement that they are very open-minded. But in the 6 months that have transpired between the initial invitation and my actual trip, the UCC church has gotten mad and moved out of the Unitarian congregation's building. And though I'm still speaking at the Unitarian church in the morning, my afternoon gig is with a disparate group of what we might call the liberal diaspora, of which if you're a liberal in South Carolina, you're part of the diaspora. But a group that's not actually a church that can't quite ideologically say we're close enough to Unitarian to join the Unitarian church. Now, you don't need for me to tell you that South Carolina is a red state. If such a thing is possible, it might be slightly more red than Missouri. And if the tiny group of progressives in Clemson can't figure out how to tolerate one another's company in a loving way, if they don't get this figured out, both congregations are likely to fail. I feel a little sheepish about it because our tiny seated congregation here in Springfield only survives through the grace of the donations of our internet viewers. We aren't big enough to support ourselves either. And there's a Unitarian church a few miles from here that can't afford to hire a pastor. And yet we've never had a serious talk about merger. I've held out the olive branch several times through the years. I've tried to raise the topic, but you know, there's like 3 or 4 modestly progressive churches in town, and we've had members that have just kind of rotated around all 4. So, and we've had a couple of folks come through here 2 or 3 times. You know, they'll go to one of the others and come here and then wherever. So in each of the others, there's just enough people that used to be here that wouldn't want us to merge, or of their folks that are here that wouldn't want us to merge. And it just kills me that progressive communities just look at each other through such critical eyes that we have a real chance of reelecting Donald Trump in 2020. Not because Donald Trump knows how to win, but progressives don't know how to stop losing. I think that we can do better. And for the sake of progressive faith movements everywhere, and for the safety of everyone in the world, I sincerely pray that we'll get this figured out.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.